long time ago, I owned a beat-up 1969 Chevy Nova that I paid less than $700 for, so you can tell what kind of shape that old car was in. I hoped that it would last long enough to get me through my undergraduate years at the University of British Columbia. As you know, I was a late bloomer. I didn't get around to doing my undergraduate degree until I was 32 years old, when I enrolled in the religious studies program at UBC. And I was living in a really shabby basement apartment. The rent was cheap. The parking was non-existent. And if I was lucky, I'd find a parking spot in the alley behind the basement apartment. And walking in that dark alley at night was more than a little bit scary. It wasn't exactly the best part of town. Often, as I was hurrying through the dark alley at night, I would see this old woman who was obviously living rough in a makeshift tent in the alley. It wasn't much of a shelter, just some cardboard sort of cobbled together by old clothes and torn grocery bags. The old woman and I, we never spoke to one another. But after several weeks of seeing one another in that back alley, we would quietly nod to one another in recognition. I knew that she belonged in the neighborhood, and she knew that I belonged in the neighborhood. And neither of us was comfortable in that back alley at night, and it seemed almost comforting to see a familiar face rather than running into some totally unknown stranger. One morning I was hurrying off to class, and I heard that old woman moaning inside her makeshift tent. And I'm ashamed to say that her moans frightened me. And I dashed to my car, unlocked it as quickly as I could, and drove off to university so that I could continue my studies. The irony that I was studying the religions of the world was not lost on me. I had a certain amount of guilt for not having done something. Now, I had some brilliant professors at UBC who taught me all sorts of things, but none of those wise professors ever taught me as much as one of my fellow students taught me. My classmate, Sandy, he taught me more about religion than any of those wise professors. Sandy is Hindu. It's a Hindu name, and for Hindus, living into their name is a very important aspect of their life's journey. I didn't know what his name meant for quite some time. Anyway, I kind of suspect that Sandehi traveled this earth in many incarnations because he possessed a wisdom way beyond his 20 years of age. To this day, some of what I learned from Sandehi continue to work in me. You know, the stuff that I learned from him, it just sort of bubbles up in me, and I still try to teach it to others when I can. It was Sandehi who taught me the Hindu understanding that all gods are but pale imitations of the one God who lies at the very heart of all that is. And it was from Sandehi that I first learned the Hindu description of the mystery that we call God, that I have come to love above all descriptions of the Divine One. And you've heard me use this description many, many times here. God is beyond the beyond and beyond that also. Now, despite the difference in our ages and backgrounds, or maybe because of those differences, Sandehi and I, we became study partners. And together we navigated the murky waters of something called religious methodology. Suffice it to say that it wasn't the most interesting of topics to study. And we worked together to learn some of the religious practices of people very different from ourselves. Sandhi often spoke about his home in India and how he couldn't wait to have me there as his guest so that he could show me what India was really like, because I had only been there as a travel consultant, and I had only been there as a tourist, and so I didn't know anything about India. One evening, I offered Sandhi a ride home in my car, and to this day, I'm not sure whether he was teasing me or if he was actually seriously impressed with that old Chevy. I remember him running his hand over the white vinyl roof and making a sort of tutting sound as his head bobbed from side to side, and he expressed his admiration of such a fine mode of transportation. Driving along, our conversation about the nature and reality of God was so engrossing that I invited Sandhi to stop off at my place for a cup of tea. I was a little nervous because I just had, what I'm sure he considered really inferior tea. It was the best tea I could get, but I invited him to come in for some tea so that we could continue our conversation and maybe get a head start on one of our study projects. And that's how we ended up talking to the old woman who lived in the back alley behind my basement apartment. Turns out her name was Joanna. In just a few moments, Sandhi had learned that she liked milk and just a touch of sugar with her tea. Now, I never dreamed of offering that old woman a cup of tea, and Sandhi never dreamed of not offering her a cup of tea. Sandhi could not understand my agitation with him. He kept reminding me that I and Joanna are one. He would go, "You are one and the same. Joanna is a woman, and you are a woman. You are one." This fact, together with the knowledge that Joanna was her name, failed to impress me. Indeed, I must confess that I was annoyed with Sandhi for introducing me to this old woman. As long as she was just some old woman sleeping rough, I could acknowledge her existence without being touched by her presence. I didn't want to be touched by this woman's presence, but I was too ashamed to share this information with Sandhi. I remember thinking, Sandhi is a Hindu from India. How could I expect him to understand how I, a Christian from Canada, felt about the woman who lived in the back alley? So I let Sandhi prattle on and on about how I and this old woman, and indeed Sandhi, are all one. But I didn't really know what on earth my Hindu friend was talking about. When they had eaten their meal, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon Ben-John, do you love me more than these?" Peter said, "Yes, Rabbi, you know that I am your friend." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." A second time, Jesus put the question, "Simon Ben-John, do you love me?" Peter said, "Yes, Rabbi, you know that I am your friend." Jesus replied, "Tend my sheep." A third time, Jesus asked, "Simon Ben-John, do you love me as a friend would?" And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked, "Do you love me?" A third time. So he said, "You know everything, Rabbi. You know that I am your friend." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." It's not easy to hear the demands of love. It's not easy to respond to the demands of love. It's not easy to be love in this world of ours. And yet, it's so very simple to hear, respond, and be love in this world. As simple as a cup of tea. Before I learned from Sandhi, I didn't really understand who Jesus was talking about when he said, "Feed my sheep." Don't get me wrong, I knew exactly what Jesus was saying in this story. I'd read it dozens of times, I'd studied it in church, I'd heard lots of sermons about Jesus teaching us to love our neighbors. I knew all about Jesus' compassion, but I knew nothing about what it means to be compassion. If I'm honest, I suppose I was far more comfortable with flocks of sheep with which I have more in common, sheep who belong to the same flock that I belong to. Even though I know that in Christ we are all one, that in Christ there is no longer a distinction between people, and that caring for Jesus' flock means caring for everyone. It is a whole lot more comfortable caring for people I feel comfortable with. We humans are a tribal lot. We find it so much easier to ignore the plight of a fellow human if they don't happen to belong to our tribe. How else do you explain child poverty, homelessness, famine, genocide, or any of the countless atrocities that happen over and over again all around the world, and yes, that happen in our neighborhoods? We say we love Jesus, and Jesus says right back to us, "Feed my sheep." Do we assume that Jesus means some special sheep somewhere? If we are one in Christ, then all of us are Jesus' sheep. In our long conversation Sunday, he would often tell me that I would not find the answers I was searching for in the books we were struggling to read. Sunday, he insisted that just as Jesus taught, I would find the answers I was seeking deep within myself. He would often encourage me to look deep inside so that I might discover that the transcendent God for whom I long is actually the immanent God who lives within me, within all of us. Now, I always loved the sounds of Sandehi's sentences, but I could never feel their meaning inside of myself, and so the one for whom I longed for continued to elude me. Sandehi is right, of course. I have never, no matter how hard I have tried, and I have tried, believe me, but I have never been able to find the one I long for in books. I have, however, found hints about the object of my longing in the stories people tell about their encounters with the one in whom we live and move and have our being. In his book, A New Harmony, the Scottish mystic John Philip Newell tells a story about his first trip to India. One day, says Newell, as he sat in a garden in Bangalore, he was approached by an elderly Indian gentleman. The gentleman greeted Newell kindly, and they entered into a conversation. After a few pleasantries, in which Newell learned that the elderly man was a retired banker, the man said with a gentle sideways wagging of his head, "I have a question for you. Who are you?" Now, Newell sensed that he was not asking what his name was, but Newell was still a little hesitant, and he wanted to sort of ease gently into this conversation, so he said, "My name is John Philip." To which the Indian gentleman replied, still kindly nodding his head from side to side, "I was not asking what your name is. I was asking, who are you?" So Newell said to him, "I come from the same one you come from." And this pleased the gentleman well enough, and they proceeded with their discussion, in which the gentleman described for Newell the heart of Hindu wisdom. He spoke of the self within all selves, and of true knowledge as consisting of an awareness that ourselves are rooted in the one who is the heart of all life. He then said, with an even more emphatic waving of his head, "I must be going now, but I have one final thing to say to you. You are God." You are God, and until you realize that you are God, you will not be wise, you will not be happy, and you will not be free. Namaste. And off he went. I come from the same one as you come from, the one who lies at the heart of all being, the one in whom all life is rooted. Namaste. The God in me greets the God in you. The morning after Sunday, he introduced me to my neighbor. I couldn't dash off to school anymore without first bringing Joanna a cup of tea every single morning. Not just any tea, mind you, tea with milk and just a touch of sugar. That gesture did not come easy to me. And I'm ashamed to say that I was very uncomfortable each time I brought her her tea. And that was reflected in the way I handed Joanna her tea. I sort of grasped the cup by the rim so that she could grab a hold of it, grab the handle without ever risking the possibility that she might touch me. I didn't want to be touched by her. After several weeks of serving Joanna tea, it seemed only prudent that I should leave my car door unlocked. So every time I parked it in that back alley, I left my car door open so that she could crawl in and sleep in the back. And each morning on my way to school, I would surrender a cup of tea and she would give me my car back. That old Chevy Nova didn't make it through to my final year at UBC. It became hopelessly unroadworthy and I had to replace it. I got a really spectacular replacement. It was orange. It was something called a Ford Fiesta, for those of you who know cars, so you know what a piece of junk it was. And I only paid $300 for it. I drove it all the way to Calgary twice. Sunday he decided to finish his studies at home in India, and together we came up with this really cunning plan for that old Chevy Nova. I transferred the ownership to Sunday because I knew that he was leaving the country. Could not be traced. And together we abandoned the Chevy on a lot just under an overpass a few blocks away from my basement apartment. We parked that old Nova, locked it up, and gave the keys to Joanna. That old Nova provided a home for Joanna long after Sandehi, and who was now the rightful owner, the legal owner of this vehicle, returned to his beloved home in India. Now, I didn't see much of Joanna after she moved into my car. Gone was our morning tea service. I moved out of the neighborhood, but for several months, I would scan that neighborhood. I would drive out of my way so that I could scan that neighborhood, looking for her. And eventually the city does what the city does, and they towed that old Nova away, and they probably tried to find its rightful owner. And with that old car went my opportunity to meet the God who dwelled within Joanna. We are all one, inextricably linked, sheep of the same flock. And we will not be well, we will not be whole, as long as an old woman sleeps rough on the streets of any city. We cannot know our oneness with the divine mystery as long as we recoil from touching, actually touching the suffering of the earth and her inhabitants. I was afraid to let Joanna touch me. I never listened to her story. I never did find out what demons haunted her and drove her into the back alleys. of a very dangerous city. I was afraid of Joanna and her demons, and that fear caused me to miss an encounter with the Holy One who dwells in her. The suffering of the world is enormous, and I'm not sure that I have what it takes to let the suffering of the world touch me. It feels a bit like holding on to a teacup from the upper edges so as the thirsty ones cannot touch me. And yet, we come from the same one as they come from. The one who lies at the heart of all being, the one in whom all life is rooted. Now, before he returned to his home in India, Sandhi blessed me by sharing with me the meaning of his name in Hindi. Now, to learn the meaning of one's name is a lifelong quest, not just for Hindus, but for many people who trace their ancestry back to the ancient Near East. Sandhi comes from a Hindi word, actually from several Hindi words that mean sacred place or holy temple. Sandhi told me that it was both an honor and a huge responsibility to bear a name that speaks the truth not only about the body that he inhabits, but the truth about the person he is in this lifetime. In this lifetime, he is a sacred, holy place. Sandhi touched me with his gentle grace and challenged me with his holiness. And I have been scarred by his touch. And I treasure that scar because, like all scars, it changed me forever. I remain challenged by Sandhi's holiness as the God in me longs to meet the God I find in those whose suffering continues to frighten me. Fearful demons live in me and separate me from myself and those who live around me. And I suspect that fearful demons also live in some of you. What will it take for us to evict our demons so that we can be touched and risk touching others? I don't have an answer to this question. All I have is a story. It is our story, the story of the risen Christ, beseeching us to feed and to tend. And feeding and tending require touching. My friend Sandhi, his touch reminds me that we are all Sandhi, for we are all a sacred place. We are all a holy temple. And we are called to recognize that we are one, and in our oneness, we are called to recognize the one who dwells in those we see as other. Namaste. Shanti. Peace. The one in me greets the one in you. Namaste. Shanti.